So, as the new school year is approaching, it's quite interesting to see how the Ontario math curriculum is being changed and updated, let's just put it that way. And this year, that struck my mind was the specific strand, which is around the B operations section. And this year, a couple of things that we're going to look at in this chart in terms of the operations. But what grade are we going to be looking at here? Specifically here, we're going to be looking at the grade 7 level. So this here is going to be an overview of what you should expect in terms of how it looks like flowchart wise, and here is how it's going to look like. So the first thing that you should be aware of in terms of addressing operations at the grade 7 level is this here, which is known as looking at the properties. And this properties here is going to be combined with that of operations. And so what does this mean? This means here that all the operations that we know of, like for example addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, we are going to look at how they play in terms of different properties. Now, first property here that we're going to look at, or your class should be aware of, is this, which is known as looking at identities, I would say properties. And this here relates really well to the operations, not only addition and subtraction, but also multiplication and division. Now the next one here is cumulative properties. This here only applies mainly to addition and multiplication. The next property that you should be aware of or should be addressed is in the form of associative properties, and this here applies to the same thing as the previous one, addition and multiplication. And the next property here is known as distributive property, and distributive property here only applies to multiplication. So now when we're looking at all the operations that you've known and you're given a big expression with different numbers and different operations, how are you going to solve to get the final answer? This is where our order of operations comes into play, and this here looks at the BEDMAS method, and the one that is really popular is the bracket, exponent, the division and multiplication, whichever one comes first, moving from left to right in your expression, and addition and subtraction, whichever one comes first from left to right you saw first. And so this is what you should be aware of for properties and operation under the specific expectations for the operation strand. Now the next specific expectation here is looking at converting. And what are we going to be converting here? The converting part here deals with all we know in terms of, yes, percent going to fractions and going to decimal and vice versa. So this here is kind of like a triangle setup here, going from one to the other, and we're going to look at future videos on strategies that you can implement at the grade 7 level. Now the next one here, which is the next specific expectations that we'll be looking at, is building on the converting of this particular part here, which is percent. And how we're going to be looking at percent here when it comes to percent changes. The percent changes here is going to be mainly looking at the word problem styles. Like for example, how about you're saying you're increasing by a percent value? How is that going to look like? Or they say you're going to decrease by a percent value. How does that look like? We're going to look at this in future videos with regards to percent changes in this particular operation strand. Now the next one here is looking at addition and subtraction, but this here is going to be specifically looking at two things. First thing here is addition and subtraction of integers, but the integers here we want to explain it visually, and there are two ways of approaching this. According to the curriculum, it states that you can either use number line, we're going to discuss that in details number line combined with what arrows. And this here is what we're going to be using as strategies to deal with solving integers for addition and subtraction. Another one here that you're going to be exposing your students to is known as what, using a kind of a system known as a two-column counter system. So two-column counter system, but this counter system is combined with the zero principle, and we're going to look at this as well in details visually. It gets pretty complicated because the integers, not only are we looking at positive integers but negative integers, and the tricky part is when you have subtraction of a positive and negative, or negative and positive, or combination of the same integer values. It's just interesting to see how it looks like using the counter system alongside that of the number line with arrow system. But the zero principle is really fascinating to dive into in details. Anyways, that is it for addition and subtraction, looking at integers visually. Now the other part here is looking at fractions of addition and subtraction, and this here comes in two ways. Technically, I would say the first way is recommended by the curriculum, and this first way here is known as using equivalent fractions, and this here is a way to get denominators that are different to be the same denominators, so you can add or subtract the numerators and keep the denominator and then reduce if possible. We'll look at examples of this in future videos. Now the other method that I usually use sometimes, if kids are kind of confused, is using the greatest common multiple of the denominators. By that way, they can get the common multiple, divide the common multiple by the denominator, and then that gives the scale factor that is multiplied by the numerator. So that is pretty much the same way as using the equivalent fractions, but that's something to keep in mind when it comes to an optional way of using this particular method to solve fractions of addition or subtraction. Now the final one here is looking at multiplication and division, and this here is going to be addressing a couple of interesting things here with regards to, first, students should be able to know how to derive the greatest common factor, and this here can be done in two ways. One is either they use a list system, or they use a system known as a factor tree system. And so this here is a way for students to be able to see the common factors, or in this case prime factors, and that will be expanded as we dive into examples in future videos. Now next thing here is, how about the lowest common multiple? There is a way of dealing with this, but the one that is really popular, of course, is using the list method to arrive at what is the lowest common multiple. Now once you've established this, making your students be familiar with the multiplication table, and highlighting all these multiples inside the multiplication table versus the factors that are outside the multiplication table, then the next part here is from the greatest common factor section, which is known as the factor tree. You can actually play around with exponent form, and exponent form here looks at how you can group repeating multiplications to form a smaller way of writing that particular, I would say, expanded form. So it's particular notation that's familiar is Bn, where B is what is the number that is repeating, and N is how many of that numbers that are repeating displayed or multiplied by itself. So that is something to be aware of when it comes to exponent form. And the next one here is looking at ways by which we can do multiplication and division of fractions, and this here specifically of fractions looks at what the two methods that are required for way to address fractions. And these two methods here, one is known as the area method or model, and the area model applies to not only multiplication but also division. However, the other method, which is known as the number line. The number line only applies to only division, not multiplication. So we'll look at examples of this in our future videos on this Factoid channel. And the next one here is not only looking at fractions, but also we're looking at decimals. And how does this look like in terms of methods of applying particular operations to different decimals? This here in this particular case looks at two ways in this case. Now, first is we're going to look at multiplication of decimals and what are the strategies that will enable us to determine the result when we multiply two or more decimals. And in this case here, one is either using the Arial model, or we have the other method, which is using the algorithm method. And so we're going to look at algorithm method in details when you are multiplying all the numbers, and then we count the number of digits after the decimal point for the given values, and then apply it to the final result. And it's going to be interesting to see that particular strategy for students to be aware of instead of using calculators. And the next one here is how about decimals, but you're dividing decimals. And so this here, the only method that students are going to be exposed to is known as just creating whole numbers. Once you create whole numbers for the given values, then you can just do long division right away, or reduce the fraction if possible, and you'll get your final answer. And so once you have this taken care of, the final one here is known as proportion. Now, proportion is a separate specific expectations, but I'm just going to erase this arrow here and put it right over here for proportion. Now, there are two ways of looking at proportion. Either we have the true proportion or the non-proportional values or analysis. And what does that mean? So proportional means that you have some kind of like a scale factor way, or by using cross multiplication, in order for you to determine the new fraction, and that is what it looks like. So this can either be using equivalent fraction method, or we can use rate, that is constant rate, or you can use ratios, and those are the key terms that you need to be aware of when we say that something is proportional. However, a non-proportional system can just be anything that has to do with, let's say, growing patterns or shrinking patterns, and or you have punctuating rate. I hope you found this really informative in terms of looking at the specific expectations for the operation strand, which is assigned letter B. I hope you found this really informative. Please hit the comment down below, let me know your thought about this, and on our future videos we'll look at examples of how to implement all these specific expectations in your classroom. See you all on the next one. Stay smart as always, and believe in yourselves.